Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, class, whenever you're deciding to join me, and thank you for joining in our English Language Arts virtual instruction for the week of April 27th, 2020. So we are now in the fourth week of quarter four. We're halfway done. Progress reports are going out the middle of this week. So grades, I think, are due Wednesday, I want to say. So if you want to improve your grade for progress reports, please meet with me and see what we can do to make your grade better. If you're missing some work, get it turned in, so on and so forth. Here's an overview of what you will be responsible for this week. You have your attendance question, achieve article, and this week we will be exploring the poem The End in the Beginning by Wisława Szymborska. We'll knock out our three-part assignment just like normal, assignment 6A, which will be a quick pre-reading activity, assignment 6B, which has two parts. Sorry, it does not have two parts. And which will be a during reading activity, and assignment 6C, which will be a post-reading activity. And then finally, you have your independent reading log. All of this will be submitted as one document and it is due May 1st. If you have not done so already, go ahead and answer the attendance question on Teams. The question for this week is, who do you admire and why? Name one person you admire and explain why you admire them. Please answer in a complete sentence. Respond by May 1st, 2020 to be counted as present for the week. Our achieve article this week is Joy So Brave You Are Crazy. There is no stretch article this week, so whatever you make on this article will be the points you're given out of 10. There is a video that goes along with this article that I really enjoyed, so definitely check that out before you complete the activity. Okay, so our focus for this week is the reading standard RL 2.4. This reading standard focuses on us being able to determine the meaning of words and phrases as they're used in a text, including figurative and connotative meanings, analyze the cumulative impact of specific word choice or meaning and tone. For example, how the language evokes a sense of time and place, how it sets a formal or informal tone. So this week we're going to be more focused on the tone. We are working with a literature standard, so it is not an informational text. It's a literary text, is a poem. And we want to think about the figurative meaning and connotative, which is the deeper meaning of words. So words have a denotative meaning, which is their dictionary definition, but then they also have a meaning that goes a bit deeper. So they have, most poems, the word choice is very important. Authors scrutinize over the words that they choose very carefully because they have to say a lot within a little. So keep that in mind as we read today. So let's unpack this a bit. Tone is simply the attitude of the author within a text towards the subject they are writing about. Tone is often confused with mood, which is an emotional response that the reader experiences. The tone that the author establishes in the text significantly impacts the reader's mood, so the two terms are very much so connected to one another. So tone is the author's attitude within the text, which is sometimes different than the mood, which is the reader's response. Sometimes they're the same, but they are, I have seen it over and over again, confused. We're not thinking about how we feel from this text. We're thinking about how the author is, what the author is presenting, right? Their attitude. So why is it important to understand the tone or attitude of the author within a text, in both literary and informational texts? Well, when we interact with content that reveals the feelings of an author, we are positioned to better understand their perception of the world in which he or she lives. So looking at the tone or the author's attitude lets us see into the author's world, lets us see things from their perspective. When the reader understands the perspective or viewpoint of the author, we are then tasked to further examine our own. These are important text-to-self reflections that build engagement in the reading process. So once we understand the author's viewpoint or perspective, it helps us re-examine our own. So we can see, different views of the world. Very important. So literature is often thought of as a window and a mirror, which is why it is an essential aspect to our cultures. A mirror is a story that reflects your own existence and helps you build your identity and view of the world. A window is a resource that offers you a view into someone else's experience. Once we develop an intimate understanding of life through literature, our society evolves to accommodate diverse perspectives on the issue at hand. Literature uniquely shapes the future and reflects the past. So by looking at the attitude or the tone of the author, we're able to have a window into their perspective. And then maybe we can see ourselves in their writing, which would make it, into a mirror. And then that gives us, it evolves our society to accommodate these diverse perspectives or these different viewpoints all into one. It's awesome stuff. Let's get ready to knock out our pre-reading activity assignment 6A. As you already know, because we say it every week, strong readers always activate their background knowledge and make personal connections to any text that they read. Our anchor text today is the poem The End and the Beginning, written by Wisława Szymborska, centers around the war and the aftermath. Before responding to the prompt, we'll watch a video that relates to the content of today's text. This video is a reading of the poem Dulce es et decorum est by Wilfred Owen, which takes readers on a journey through a soldier's grim experience on the battlefield during war. Let's take a look at our video. In this video, animation has been added to the poem to bring the words to life and help us visualize the realities of war that have been captured in the writing. So we'll watch the video now.
Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. Someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes of thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Okay, so I really enjoyed the animations. I think it puts you into the soldier's experience, and also the reader's tone. The man who read the poem was very expressive. I think it is a great video of this poem. All right, now let's access assignment 6. Locate the section 6A. Follow along as I read the directions for this activity. After you have read the animated poetry, after you have viewed the animated poetry, Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, respond to the prompts below. Number 1, briefly research the Latin phrase Dulce et Decorum Est. What does the phrase mean? So you want to look it up on Google and maybe do some research and then write your definition here. Number 2, why might the author, Wilfred Owen, believe that the phrase Dulce et Decorum Est is a lie? So here you want to think about what the phrase means and what you viewed in the video and how the author might think that this phrase is a lie. Number 3, consider your personal opinion on the meaning of the phrase Dulce et Decorum Est. Do you believe that Dulce et Decorum Est stands to be true, or do you believe that it is false, a lie? Explain your reasoning. So think about the meaning and then your personal feelings, because we want to make a personal connection with the text so that we are more engaged in our reading, right? So we want to have our own opinion. So take about 10 minutes to complete the warm-up activity. When you're done, join me back in the slideshow. You may pause here. Having some technical difficulties. Sorry, guys. Okay. Welcome back. To help build our understanding of tone, let's consider an analysis of the tone in the poem Dulce et Decorum Est. Some scholars believe that the tone or attitude of the author of this anti-war poem is bitter. Owens is bitter at the way warfare, and in particular World War I, has been glorified. This leads to the ironic title, Dulce et Decorum Est, a Latin phrase which means it is sweet and honorable. It is taken from a longer passage from Horace, Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria mori, which means it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country. The vivid, violent imagery in the poem shows in contrast that dying for one's country is anything but sweet and honorable. The soldiers in the opening lines are not sweet, noble, or heroic. They are knock-kneed and coughing like hags. They are weary, blind, lame, limping, fatigued. Much of the poem describes the horrific effects of gas attack. Once again, Owen shows the misery and lack of glory in war. The blood gurgles from the lungs of the gas victims as he is jolted along in the wagon, while sores form on his tongue. The speaker ends bitterly by stating that if people could see the horrors, they would not believe that it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country. So hopefully that shed some light on the tone of the poem and will help you have a better idea of the tone in the poem for the end and the beginning. So let's clarify the larger question that we must answer when reading our poem, The End and the Beginning. The essential question is what we must be able to answer by the end of our lesson. How does the author, Wisława Szymborska, establish a somber yet optimistic tone on the subject of war and its aftermath in her poem, The End and the Beginning? Throughout the reading of this poem, we must discover the true meaning of the phrase used in the stanza, which will then reflect her perspective of war and its aftermath. We will search for lines that suggest both her feelings of somberness and optimism. A somber tone is oppressively solemn, sad, and depressed. However, an optimistic tone is hopeful about the future, which is generally positive and uplifting. Now let's access the graphic organizer that we'll use to help us interact with our essential question. This graphic organizer is assignment 6B. So we're going to access our assignment, and we're also going to access the text. I am not going to split screen this week because basically the entire poem is on the graphic organizer. So remember to get to your online textbook. You hit popular links, blended learning, and then you scroll down to the Houghton Mifflin Harcourt or my HRW icon. We're going to log in. We're going to click on Student eBook. And then at the top, you can either put in 351, which is the page that the poem is on, or you can go through your table of contents. It is collection 5, A Matter of Life or Death, the end and the beginning, and then read the text, of course. Okay, I'm going to zoom in so that it's easier to read. And I think it's important to read the about the author because almost always, especially in poems, is very personal. So this can give us some insight into the poem and maybe help us understand the meaning a little better. So Wisława Szymborska was born in Western Poland and spent most of her life in Krakow, Poland. Her first 2 published volumes of poetry, written in post-World War II communism-dominated Poland, were written in the style of socialist realism. Szymborska later disowned these works. Her disillusionment with communism was reflected in Calling Out to Yeti, published in 1957. Her poems, noted for the unique, ironic tone, have been translated into many languages. Szymborska was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1996. So we know she is an amazing writer because she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. But also we know that she lived through World War II in communist-dominated Poland, and that shaped her writing for a while, and then later she disowned it. So I think that's some great background information. So The End and the Beginning by Wisława Szymborska. So the first time we read a poem, we just want to get a good idea of what it means on the surface. And probably the most important part of poems, after the actual words in the poem, is the title. If you are a poet, your title is very important. Poets, really stress over the title of their poems. They mean a lot. They have double meanings. They have deeper meanings. So if we look at the end and the beginning, you want to think about, before we even read the poem, what it could mean. So the end and the beginning, it starts with the end and then a beginning. So maybe me just thinking about it, maybe it has to do with, how although people die, other people are born. So someone's end is another person's beginning or something like that. That's the feelings I'm getting. Usually, you start with the beginning and then you go to the end. So I think it's important that she started with the end and went to the beginning. Okay, so in our first reading, we're just going to think about what the poem could possibly be about. So after every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagon can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody racks. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic is not, and it's taken years. All the cameras have left for another war. We'll need the bridges back and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with unsevered head. But always there are those nearby, starting to mill about, who find it dull. From out the bushes, sometimes someone still unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little, and less than little, and finally as little as nothing. In the grass that has overgrown, causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in mouth, gazing at the clouds. So if I think about what is going on in this poem on the surface, I would say she's talking about how after war, there's a cleanup process. So if I want to relate it to my own experiences, I've never personally been through war. Some of you may have come from war-torn countries, but me personally, the only real destructive force I've had in my life would be like a hurricane, and it destroys everything, but then you have to clean up afterwards. And I can kind of see how that would be an end and a beginning. So the hurricane destroys everything, and that's the end of something, but life goes on. So you have to build, you have to renew and build. So that's how I feel after the first reading. So now we're going to do our second reading. And in our second one, we want to think about what the deeper meaning could be, the attitude of the speaker, if there is a shift in the poem, whether that be time and place, a tonal shift, maybe like the length of the poem or the words that they were using, some kind of shift. And then, think about the theme. So here we go. After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagon can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody racks. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic it's not, and takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. We'll need the bridges back and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with unsevered head. But so unsevered head would be like, they lived through the war, so they still have their head attached. But already there are those nearby starting to mill about or move around. Who will find it dull? From out of the bushes, sometimes someone still unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on here must make ways for those who know little and less than little, and finally as little as nothing. In the grass that is overgrown, causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. So I want to think about a deeper meaning. And so on the surface, it is about rebuilding after the war, but maybe on a deeper meaning, it is about how people who live through the war have to put the end or the past behind them and think about rebuilding a future, right? These lines stand out to me, that those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little and less than little, and finally as little as nothing. So time keeps continuing after the war, and people are born that don't know what's going on, and these old folks who knew what went on here, have to move on with the time and have a new beginning. So if we recall in our essential question, there is a shift in the tone. And I definitely have the feeling that it goes from somber on this first page, like there's no hope left, depressed. This is her tone, but it also made me feel that way through her word choice. And then somewhere on this second page, maybe I can start feeling it change here, but definitely in these last three stanzas is definitely, I can definitely see that optimistic tone where people are leaving the war in the past and looking towards the future. So if you are ever reading a poem, you definitely want to pay attention to where it shifts. This one is quite obvious, and it is a tonal shift, which is quite a big one, almost an opposite tonal shift. Starts out depressing, goes to more optimistic. But if you're ever analyzing a poem, make sure you pay attention to that. So the last thing I want to do before I start doing my tonal analysis is look back at the title, the end and the beginning. Well, the first time I read it, I thought maybe it was about death and new life. It's kind of like that, but I think it's leaving your past tragedies in the past and then, looking towards the future and having that more optimistic view, not letting what happened in the past ruin your future. I think that's more the meaning of this. And I see how the end from the title mirrors the beginning of the poem, and then the end of the poem mirrors the beginning of a new life. So we have a real meta thing going on here that is very clever of Viswala. And then lastly, we want to think about theme, and I think just looking at the title, I think we already said it before, is that you can't let your past mar your future, right? You have to, you have to clean up the tragedies of the past and make way for a better future, or something along those lines. Okay. So now that we've read through this poem twice, we're going to dig real deep into an analysis, mostly on tone. So we're going to go into 6B, our assignment. Follow along as I read the directions for the activity. While reading the poem The End and the Beginning by Wisława Szymborska, complete the graphic organizer below. This includes the poetry stanza, column 1, so you're not going to do anything with column 1, it just has the stanza of the poem. Its meaning in your own words, column 2, so this is where you do what do you think the poem means on a deeper level. Your categorization of each stanza as the end or the beginning, is she talking about the end, destruction of life, or the beginning, the start of a new life, moving beyond the past and into the future? And the tone, somber or optimistic, of the speaker within each stanza. So that's column 4. Also note that throughout the reading, we may run across an occasional stanza that may lack a detachable tone of either somber or optimistic. In this case, you may consider it to be objective, just the facts and the absence of emotion towards the subject. And it says these are very few throughout the poem. So we know that most of the stanzas are either going to be somber or optimistic. Okay, so we're going to focus on each specific stanza now, since they're in the graphic organizer. We don't have to go back to the text. So this will be considered our third reading. So after every war, someone has to clean up things. Someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. So we have an example here. So ultimate meaning, what does Szymborska want readers to understand about war and its impact on soldiers? So war brings the sort of damage and destruction that does not heal on its own over time. After war, soldiers must take immediate action to restore life and normalcy. Now, a lot of times we're talking about the soldiers in war because they experience it firsthand, but I also think that people who live in these war-torn cities are experiencing things close to these soldiers. So When we talk about soldiers, I think we can also talk about or keep in mind the people who go through the war as well. So although we're saying soldiers, I think it also applies to them as well, the people that have to rebuild their town, right? The next part is categorize the end or the beginning. So this says after every war, so that war has ended. So I'm going to say end. It's the destruction of life. And then is the tone oppressively solemn, sad, sober, and mood depressing, or hopeful about the future? Well, I am not seeing any hope in these lines about after the war, so I'm going to put somber. Okay, so this one is blank, so we'll have to do this one together. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. So if I'm looking at this stanza, I might say that it means war is inevitably filled with death, right? We have that corpse-filled wagon that reminds us. And soldiers must confront this reality, cleaning up war's aftermath. I think that can also be said for the people who live in these war-torn countries. You know, their family members have died. They see the dead bodies on the street. So everyone really must confront the reality that war is inevitably filled with death. So we want to think if this is the end or the beginning. If I look at this, I see the words rubble. I see the words corpse-filled wagon, and I'm definitely thinking this is the end. It literally talks about death, which is the end of life. It talks about the destruction because we're pushing rubble of the destroyed buildings and everything. And then these words, corpse-filled wagon, definitely has a somber or depressing tone. So if she would have used words like of those who passed away, yes, it's sad, but corpse-filled wagons really has imagery of the horror of war, right? Pushing the rubble creates that imagery. Okay, moving on. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody rags. So just reading this stanza, I see that strong, impactful word choice. We have mired, which means completely consumed, scum, splintered glass, bloody rags. All of these descriptions, all of this imagery is painting the picture of horror in my head. I'm just putting myself in this situation, and it is not a happy one, right? So what does this ultimately mean? In times of war and after, soldiers will find themselves deeply stuck in the debris of war, which is oppressive and filled with pain. So not only is this stuff, reminding them of the war, but it's reminding them of all of the oppression and pain related to that war. And I think, again, we can say that not just the soldiers feel this, but everyone that, is in these war-torn cities that have to rebuild. Just by the word choice, we get that this is still an end, a destruction of life. We have the destruction here. We have these mired in scum, splintered glass, and it definitely has a somber tone. I do not see any hope in this line, even though she's talking about going through the rubble to probably rebuild. Okay, moving on. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. So what does this ultimately mean? Well, after the war, soldiers must work tirelessly to restore life and the land that has been destroyed through the battle. The buildings that collapsed in the war must now be brought back to life piece by piece until functionality is restored. So this is talking about rebuilding the town after the war. So I'm definitely seeing a change, a shift from just being completely consumed by death and destruction into the new beginnings, right? So we're going to say beginning, and we're seeing some optimism. We are not, you know, crying in the rubble. We are starting to rebuild. Okay. Photogenic it's not, and takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. So what does this mean? Well, I relate this back to, because it's my only experience with destruction, a hurricane. So when the hurricane is happening, people are so invested in watching the destruction, right? They want to see those firsthand videos of people's houses being destroyed and the water coming in and the news anchors being pushed by the wind. But then afterwards, when it's time to rebuild, after we've seen the destruction, we go on to the next tragedy, right? We don't dwell on, oh, I hope that they get their houses rebuilt. We want to know, you know, the next awful thing that's happening. It's just, I don't know, some twisted part of human nature. So the same thing with war. When it's time to rebuild, when all of the death and destruction has happened, the cameras leave, go on to the next war, and the people and the soldiers are left there to rebuild. So I'm going to say after the war, people will need to spend several years. Same true with other disasters. Recovering from the destruction. That the battle has brought. During this era of healing and restoration, it's a longer time than maybe even the war, the attention shifts away from the battlefield towards another crisis. So is this end or beginning? This is definitely after the war. People are cleaning up, so we're going to say beginning. And is it optimistic or somber? I think it has a different tone, kind of like, they're often kind of a maybe sarcastic or, you know, matter of fact. So we're going to put objective here. It is really focusing on the fact of the matter rather than, you know, the depressive awfulness of war or the hope for the future. Okay, moving on. We'll need the bridges back and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. So what does this ultimately mean? After the war, soldiers must work tirelessly, and the people that need to restore their town, to restore life and the land that has been destroyed through the battle. Soldiers embrace the opportunity to rebuild new pathways, navigate communities. So is this the end or the beginning? Is this focused on the destruction and death, or is it focused on creating a new life? Well, we have the word new. We're bringing these bridges back, and people and soldiers are pumped about this. They're going to roll their sleeves up. They're going to work hard until everything is restored, right? So I think this is definitely a beginning. And, you know, people are running their sleeves ragged. They're not just, you know, going about their day dwelling in everything that's been destroyed. They're working hard to get everything back up. So I definitely think it is optimistic. Okay. So these first stanzas have been about, that have changed to optimism, have been about rebuilding pretty literally. So now we're going to start seeing a change in people, in their mindsets, in their mentality, more so than the actual rebuilding. So this is that deeper meaning. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with unsevered head. So they lived through the war, right? Their head isn't severed. But already there are those nearby starting to mill about or move around who find it dull. So I can again relate this to the hurricane or even the coronavirus that's going on now. After it's all over, people are going to talk about it, but a lot of people are going to be like, that was the past. We need to move on. They don't even want to talk about it anymore. It's boring. It's past. It's old news, right? So the same thing happens with the war, right? So what are we going to write here? After the war, many soldiers and people who lived through it grow tired on the past and shift their attention towards the future instead. So they want to leave the horrors of war in the past and move on to something more optimistic, right? After the war, the focus is not on what was. Oops, I wrote on twice. It shifts. That shift again to what is rebuilding, right? The task at hand and what will be the bright future, hopefully, that can start after the war. So thinking about that, I think this stanza is still the beginning. People are wanting to forget the past, thinking it's boring old news, right? And they want to focus on the next thing. And I think that shows optimism, right? Okay. From out the bushes, sometimes someone unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. So this was some symbolism the author uses. She says rusted out arguments. So arguments can't be rusted out. I guess this is personification. Or not really, because she's giving an idea a tangible quality, but so maybe symbolism. So rusted out arguments would be like old ideas of the past or old sentiments of the war, and you know, people don't want to focus on that. They want to move forward. They want to put that behind them. So they're putting those old ideas and arguments into the trash, right? So I think this is her most figurative stanza so far. So what does this ultimately mean? In times of war, some soldiers and people who lived through the war cling onto their deeply rooted views and beliefs surrounding the war. But they know that it is irrelevant and has no impact on life today, right? Past. They can't change the past. They can only affect what's going on now and in the future. These thoughts are discarded as their focus shifts to the future. So we're shifting to the future. We're leaving, you know, the war ending was the end of that death and destruction. So this is still the beginning. and it is optimistic. We are putting all of those old arguments that maybe, you know, started the war in the trash. Okay. Those who know what was going on here must make way for those who know little and less than little, and finally as little as nothing. So like I said before, I think this one is very important. People, you know, live through the war and they have certain viewpoints on things and they have certain feelings because they actually experienced it. But then others are going to come along that were not part of the war, that have different viewpoints, and, you know, the future is never going to stop. You know, that's going to be in the past and we can't, you know, change any of that. And then new people are going to come along and we have to make way for them because, you know, the youth own the world, right? So what does this ultimately mean? In times of war and after, there will always be soldiers, and like I said, other people who lived through the war who have amassed a great deal of experience and knowledge, right, from the war. They lived through it. And then there are those who are ignorant to the realities of war because they weren't. They came in afterwards, right? The younger generation have not constructed their own understanding yet. So they haven't constructed their own understanding yet, or they might have views of the world that are different because they did not go through the war, and maybe they are not correct because they, you know, haven't had those experiences. So these knowledgeable people and soldiers, the ones who experienced the war, knowledgeable soldiers, deeper understanding of life must accept and support those who do not yet know the world in which they live. Right? We can't be bitter to these newbies that don't know what's going on yet. We have to be understanding. We know that it's part of life, part of moving forward, right? This is still beginning. And optimism. Leaving the past in the past. Optimism. Okay, last one. In that grass that has overgrown, causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. So I think this is our most optimistic line of the poem so far. We definitely saw a huge shift, a kind of a crescendo, starting out, you know, somber, depressive, moving into optimism, more optimism, and then finally somebody's stretched out in the grass looking at the clouds, daydreaming of what the future holds, right? This is a completely different tone of the beginning, from the beginning of the poem. So what could this mean? Soldiers and the people who lived through the war, and maybe those who don't know the realities of war, find themselves daydreaming, fully detached from today, longing for new beginnings or tomorrow. They are no longer wholly immersed in the realities of war. They are fixated on the future and its possibilities. Run wildly through them like lush, overgrown grass. So I think the possibilities are the overgrown grass, but I also think it's showing that time has passed since the war. All of the reasons that the war happened and the things that it caused have all been covered up by this overgrown grass. So it is easier for these people, for these soldiers and the people who lived through the war, to think about what's going on in the future, right? So this is definitely a new beginning and definitely optimism. I think this is a very dynamic poem. Take about 15 minutes to review your graphic organizer and add any additional information you believe is worth recording. After reviewing your tracker, return to the slideshow presentation. Poetry is up for interpretation. It is probably one of the best things about poetry. So maybe you have a different idea than I do. Feel free to, put your own ideas if you feel differently. I'd love to read them. Okay. So hopefully you enjoyed reading the poem, The End and the Beginning by Wisława Szymborska. Now, if you're ready to move forward, you're all set to complete the last part of Assignment 6, which is Assignment 6C. Please locate Assignment 6C. Follow along as I read the directions. In the space below, craft your response to the essential question. How does the author, Wisława Szymborska, establish a somber yet optimistic tone on the subject of war and its aftermath in her poem, The End and the Beginning? Note no more than one of the modeled examples should be used for your response unless you offer an alternative interpretation or analysis to the stanza be original. So in your Rassisi's paragraph, you should only be using one of these models highlighted in yellow. Use the Rassisi's writing strategy. So we are adding an additional piece of evidence for this paragraph. So I like to read through what is it called? The guide, because it tells you exactly what to write. In approximately 2 opening sentences, you should identify the author, identify the poem's title, what you believe to be her purpose for writing, the 2 tones that she establishes throughout her poem towards the subject, and briefly explain the possible meanings for the end and the beginning in your own words. Wisława Szymborska, author of, so here's an example. Wisława Szymborska, author of The End and the Beginning, wrote this poem to help readers understand whatever you think she wrote it for, while establishing a solemn yet optimistic tone toward the subject of war and its aftermath. Within the poem, the end refers to whatever you think the end refers to, while the beginning refers to whatever you believe the beginning refers to. And then we move on to our first piece of evidence. Identify one strong example that reflects Szymborska's solemn tone. So you'll go back to your graphic organizer and you'll find an example that has a solemn tone. Explain the meaning of the stanza. So you'll use what you wrote down in your meaning, ultimate meaning box. Its classification as the end or the beginning. And then here's the part where you have to do the thinking. And how, why it reflects the solemn tone. So how does your piece of evidence reflect the solemn tone, or why does it reflect the solemn tone? Up to you. Next one, identify the second strong example using the solemn tone, and then do the same thing. Explain the meaning of the stanza, its classification as the end or the beginning, and how, why it reflects the solemn tone. Then you pick another piece of evidence, but this time you need to pick one that reflects her optimistic tone. Explain the meaning, which is in your graphic organizer already done for you. Classification as the end of the beginning, already done for you. And this is your thinking part, how, why it reflects an optimistic tone. Then pick your second piece that reflects an optimistic tone and do the same thing again. Explain the meaning, its classification as the end of the beginning, and how, why it reflects an optimistic tone. And then we have our summarization. Briefly recap your points and considering the impact that literature has on society, especially in the midst of tragedy. Explain why you believe Szymborska was awarded the Nobel Prize for Poetry, heavily focused on World War II. Tip, you may wish to conduct a little research to see what scholars and other writers have said about her. And that is all you have to do. And please construct a paragraph down here. Don't write it like our Assisi's, just write one paragraph fully out. Should take you about 20 to 30 minutes to have a well-constructed response. Remember to complete your weekly reading log. Next week, you will have an assignment connected to your independent reading. So you won't do your independent reading next week. Instead, you'll do an assignment about it. So you want to make sure you're doing that. Remember to save your completed assignments with parts 6A, 6B, 6C, and your independent reading log 6D in one document. Don't forget this assignment will be due on Friday, May 1st, 2020. I so appreciate you engaging in our virtual classroom this week and look forward to continued learning in this new innovative way. Stay tuned for our next lesson next Monday, which will be special as you will complete a culminative creating task and not be assigned a specific reading. Yay! I'm looking forward to it. Have a great rest of your week. Stay safe out there.